Hello, everyone. This is number 17 in my ongoing series dealing with interpretations of Bible prophecy through the ages. And for the last 3 episodes, this will be the fourth, I've been talking about what I've called floating prophecies within the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And these are prophecies that tend to be a set piece. They're usually tagged as in the last days or in the latter days. And then they kind of float around and people try applying them all through history to various situations. And so we've been tracking some of that and talking about some of that. And today, in number 17, I've got a big one, and that is what's often called by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. All three traditions talk about this, the final battle, the wars of Gog and Magog. Most interesting to look into. As I'm making this video on November the 2nd, 2023, but there's no end of people telling you that we're on the cusp and on the edge of these final battles or these final wars. Now, those who take what's called a dispensationalist view of Bible prophecy, I talked about that last time. I've got here my Scofield Bible as a kind of show and tell. This is the old Scofield Bible, not the new one, because they're new editions. This is I think this one was printed 1945, not the actual print copy, but the edition that I'm using here. And in that interpretation of Bible prophecy, the next thing to happen, this is very Christian now, would be the rapture or taking away of the church from the earth. And then all of these things begin to happen. The final battle for Jerusalem, the wars of Gog and Magog, and so forth. So many of you who are viewing this will be very familiar with this, depending on what tradition you come from. However, let's look at some texts. It's very interesting to ask, what is this all about? Where does it come from? And you might be surprised at how many references and sources there are in all of this vast amount of literature from the Abrahamic faiths, that is, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So I'm going to share my screen here. And I'm going to go to a Google search. And let's type in, just want to show you this, the wars of Gog and Magog. Okay, that looks good. And here you see we have 1,690,000 results in just about half a second. And the first one up is the Wikipedia article. Now, there are many, many more. There are people trying to tell you what's happening today. When does the battle happen? What is it? It's clearly in the book of Ezekiel, an invasion of the land of Israel, as we're going to see. But let me go back and click on this Wikipedia article. This article is very, very, very complete. I looked it over before I made this recording, and I want to really recommend it. You've got all kinds of things about eschatology on Wikipedia, but Gog and Magog brings together, as you can see, all sorts of things. You've got to talk about the names, and you've got to talk about the setting and all of these things. And this article actually picks up at the beginning in the book of Genesis, chapter 10, where you have this table of nations. I'll come back to that in a bit. You've also got a little bit in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And of course, Ezekiel is the main passage in the Hebrew Bible. And you go on through the Midrash, Islamic texts. Look at all the Islamic texts, different branches of Islam. Alexander the Great, Josephus talks about Gog and Magog, the Alexander romances, all sorts of, look at all of this, look at all of this. And then modern apocalyptic literature, which we're dealing with, and those interpretations. So I just wanted to share that with you. Now, let's go to some texts. I'm going to begin at the end, you might say, instead of the beginning. If I was beginning at the beginning, I would go to Genesis chapter 10 as far as biblical apocalyptic ideas, but I'm going to go to Revelation 20. This is in the New Testament. And in chapter 20, you have what's going to happen after the visible return of Jesus Christ from heaven. So just to put you in the picture here, if you're not familiar with these different chapters, chapter 20 is just after what people call the return of Jesus Christ. Here's 19:11. Then I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. And then it describes him in this absolutely fabulous, glorious way. His eyes are like a flame of fire. He's got many crowns on his head and so forth. He's got a robe dipped in blood. His name is the Word of God. He's clearly Jesus Christ, returning, Lord of Lords, you see, and King of Kings. And what is he doing? He has a sharp sword, and he's going to smite the nations and rule them with a rod of iron, and he'll tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God, the Almighty. So that's the idea that you get. And then there's this heavenly banquet of the various people that he's going to destroy. And this has to do with the armies that come up against Israel. It's often called the Battle of Armageddon. The battle is actually the battle for Jerusalem, but the assembling of the forces marching down from the north on Jerusalem are actually at Megiddo, which is a valley up north in the Galilee. Whenever I lead tours of Israel, I take people to Armageddon and show them that it's a place, it's a valley. We actually drive through it and look down upon it from the tell or the ruins of ancient Megiddo. So, chapter 20. So then what happens? An angel comes down from heaven, and he has a key to a bottomless pit and a chain. And he grabs the devil, basically, the dragon, the ancient serpent, the devil and Satan, and binds him for 1,000 years. He throws him in the pit. And the way he binds them is that he cannot deceive the nations anymore. So there's 1,000-year period after Christ comes here, if you just read it as a sequential set of events, and Satan is bound so that the nations can then begin to experience the rule of God. And then there's thrones set in heaven, and the souls of those who've been beheaded are raised from the dead. They come to life and reign with Christ 1,000 years. And this refers to all the persecution in the previous chapters where they've been killed. From the author's point of view, I think it's the persecutions of the Romans against the early Christians, beginning under Nero and going up through Domitian and frankly into the 2nd century. But I don't think this text goes that far. But notice this, the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. So according to this text, you want to be in the first resurrection because you get to live and reign with Christ 1,000 years. And then there are all sorts of interpretations about what happens during this 1,000-year period, but I'm not going to cover that in this particular lecture or episode. But notice this, blessed and holy is he who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and Christ and reign with him 1,000 years. And presumably it's a reign on earth. Now, notice this, though. When the 1,000 years are ended, Satan gets loosed out of the prison, the bottomless pit, and he comes out to deceive the nations which are at the four corners of the earth. So presumably during this 1,000-year period, as the first resurrected people, they live and reign, and what they reign over are the nations. which are then brought back to God. And then you have Gog and Magog. So Satan comes out and he gathers Gog and Magog to gather them for battle. Now, in this text, these are treated as two different entities, perhaps rulers or peoples. We'll talk about that. Their numbers like the sand of the sea, and they marched up over the broad earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, which is obviously Jerusalem. Now, this is not the new Jerusalem. That comes in chapter 21 and 22. This is presented as the earth after the beast is conquered and so forth. And they march up against the camp of the saints, presumably all those who gathered back to the Holy Land and are worshiping and serving God and so forth. And the different nations are taught the ways of God. But what happens when they come up to destroy the people of God? Fire comes down from heaven and consumes them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were cast. And they will be tormented day and night forever. Then you get heaven and earth passing away, the sky passing away. There's no place for them anymore. And you get this idea that you're going into a very transcendent period. Okay, then a great white throne appears, and you get the idea that something's going to get totally transformed because the presence of earth and sky fled away, and there's no place found for them. So this is not the earth anymore. It's a new creation. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne. This is all the dead that have ever lived. This is mentioned in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, and various times in the New Testament. And books are opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. So it's like a register of who's going to get life and who's going to be cast out. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books. The books looks like, from this passage, that it's a record of your life. It has every thought and deed and intention of the heart that you've ever done, and you're being judged by what you had done. So it is a works judgment, as people sometimes call it. And the sea gave up the dead in it. That shows you that this is not resuscitating corpses or anything of that sort. That passage is very important when people talk about what is the New Testament view of resurrection of the dead. I have a whole series on ideas of death and afterlife in the ancient world. And when I get to Judaism and early Christianity, I cover this very thoroughly. It's on YouTube. Look it up as one of my series. And then death and Hades give up the dead. Hades is the world of the dead, and all were judged by what they had done. And then death and Hades itself, meaning the very idea of death, is thrown into the lake of fire. And this is that second death. And anyone not found in the book of life is thrown into the lake of fire. So the book of life already has a list of those who get preserved and saved and given eternal life. But they still undergo a judgment. So it's almost like a demonstration of what they've done. And then you get the new heaven and new earth appearing and so forth. And I will cover that in the future. But I'm going back to this Gog and Magog business, because here, notice where it is. It seems to be after the coming of Jesus in a powerful and visible way in chapter 19. And then the first resurrection, Paul calls it the dead in Christ rise first. Now, whether it's invisible and a rapture, that's a totally different question. It doesn't sound like it here. It sounds like they come to life and God's going to wipe away all the tears and so forth, as it goes on to describe. And that's at the end of the 1,000 years. And then you have this attack by Gog and Magog. So let me put in another passage. That was Revelation 20. Let's go back to the fundamental passage, Ezekiel 38. I'm going to do 37 through 39. And I just want to do 37 to show you the context. And in chapter 37, you have a famous vision that Ezekiel experiences that's called the vision of the valley of dry bones. And I'm not really covering that right now, but I just want to mention it. And the idea in the vision is that Ezekiel sees this whole valley of disarticulated bones, dried up, and nothing left. And some would take this literally, like this is the resurrection of the dead. Others take it as the revival of Israel. And so what happens is the bones begin to get flesh and they stand up and they come alive again. And then you get an interpretation. So I think it's pretty important to look at the interpretation instead of just saying, oh, this is the resurrection of the dead at the end of the age, and it would fit in with that Revelation 20. I don't think that's the case. Notice, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried up and our hope is lost. We are clean cut off. Therefore say to them, so the valley of dry bones means that Israel's been scattered and they're not a nation, but they're like in a graveyard of what's called the exile. And then it's interpreted as, behold, I will open your graves and raise you from your graves, O people of Israel, and bring you home to the land of Israel. And you will know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you home. And I'll put my spirit in you and you will live, and so forth. And then it's described further as two sticks. One is Judah, understood as the Jewish people, and at least in Roman times, and the other is the tribes of Israel, sometimes called the lost tribes. I think a better description from the prophets would be the scattered tribes of Israel. And they're in despair and they believe that they have no hope. And once again, the two sticks are put together. And what does that mean? Behold, I will take the people of Israel from the nations among which they've gone and gather them from all sides and bring them to their own land. And I will make them one nation in the land on the mountains of Israel, and one king shall rule over them. And they will no longer be two nations, but one. So this is a restoration of all the ancient tribes of Israel. Jesus apparently expected this because in one of our earliest gospel sources, the sayings material that Matthew and Luke have in common, he tells the 12, I've chosen you 12 because you're going to sit on 12 thrones ruling over the 12 tribes of Israel. So if you take that literally, as seems to be the case in this text, it's talking about a regathering of ancient Israel. Now, if that was only mentioned here, you might think it's some sort of symbolic regathering. But this regathering of Israel is the major theme of the Hebrew prophets. There's more on the regathering of the tribes of Israel, the scattered tribes of Israel and Judah, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom being put back together than any other theme in the Hebrew prophets. And this is the only thing that God says in the Hebrew prophets, I will do this with all my heart and soul. So in the entire Hebrew Bible, there's nothing else where God says, I will do this with all my heart and soul. Maybe he does a lot of things with all his heart and soul, according to the text, but it doesn't appear as a phrase, but regathering Israel does. And you can find that in the book of Jeremiah. And then notice this, my servant David shall be king over them. So if the dead are getting raised and all of Israel is coming back from their graves and so forth, does that mean literally King David? There are other texts that say, I'll raise up a descendant of David to be the Messiah. But here you actually have David. So then when you go to chapter 38, and that's the one we want to talk about, you see the context. You've got this complete restoration of Israel and a messianic kingdom set up. Well, what happens then? Son of man, set your face toward Gog of the land of Magog. So that's starting to sound like maybe a person, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. So Gog is a person, Magog is a land, and he's the chief prince of two other areas, Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against them. And then what you get described is this invasion of the regathered people of Israel. It's not quite like Revelation 20, as you can see. It doesn't say 1,000 years. It doesn't talk about just part of the dead being raised. It actually is talking about all of Israel coming back in some way. And what is he going to do? Well, he's going to come together, and he has all these weapons and armies and horses in Persia, Cush, and Put. Persia hasn't moved. It's, of course, Iran today. Cush and Put are in North Africa, in the region of Egypt and south of Egypt. All of them are going to come together. Gomer and all his hordes from the uttermost parts of the north with his hordes. Many peoples are with you. Okay, and what are they going to do? After many days, they're going to get assembled. In the latter years, they will go forth to the land that is restored from war. Now, what this describes in terms of the Israelites regathered is a very peaceful time. They've been regathered from the nations, where they've been a continual waste. They've been brought out, and look, they dwell securely. So this army from the north comes like a storm, like a cloud covering, and tries to destroy them. So it's similar to Revelation 20, but not really very similar. So Revelation 20 is one of the many texts. There are texts in the Quran, there are texts in Islamic tradition, there are other Jewish texts that talk about this invasion of the people of God regathered to the land of Israel in different kinds of sequences that are given. It's quite complicated. And this force from the north, Gog, from the land of Magog, the prince of Meshech and Tubal and all of his allies, will go up into the land of unwalled villages and fall upon the quiet people who dwell securely, all of them dwelling without walls, having no bars and gates, to seize spoil and carry off plunder, and so forth. And then it mentions others, Sheba and Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and so forth. Well, what happens is they just get utterly destroyed by fire and hail and earthquakes, and everybody basically panics, and everybody is destroyed of this invading army. Now, people try to apply this to today, and I'm going to get to that. And you, son of man, prophesy against Gog and say, behold, I'm against you, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn you about and drive you forward and bring you up from the uttermost parts of the north and lead you to Israel. And then I'm going to just literally strike you with fire and with plagues. And then it goes on and talks about the details of burying them, that it's going to take a long time to bury them, 7 months just to find all the bodies. And it talks about where they will be buried. And then apparently there's a lot of rotting bodies and flesh from this carnage. And the birds of the air are called to assemble together, and wild beasts to eat the dead bodies of these enemies. And then notice this, I will set my glory among the nations, and all the nations shall see my judgment. So this is a final decisive judgment that is going to cause the whole world to recognize the God of Israel. And the house of Israel will know that I'm the Lord from that day forward, and the nations shall know that the house of Israel went into captivity for their iniquity, because they dealt treacherously with me. I hid my face from them and put them into the hands of their adversaries. They fell by the sword. That would be the northern exile in the 8th century BC of the Assyrian captivity, and then later the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BC of Judah and the southern areas, and the destruction of Jerusalem. And then you get more details as it goes on about how Israel is going to be restored, and they're going to get gathered, and the final battle is over, and I will not hide my face anymore, and the Spirit is going to be poured out on them. Now, that's as much as I put up here through 39. So let me stop the share. Okay, so let's talk about this. You saw all those Google entries and you saw all the things that are talked about in the Wikipedia article. I'm going to turn on my desk light here. If I take this Scofield Bible, it's amazing. This was basically written at the turn of the century, of the early 20th century. And right away, you've got the King James version of what I just read. And listen to this. 38:2. This is the commentary in the footnote. The primary reference is to the Northern European powers headed up by Russia. So Scofield and many of the interpreters of his day are convinced that it's Russia, okay? And all agree, well, obviously everybody doesn't agree, but maybe many Bible students agree. The whole passage should be read in conjunction with Zechariah 12 and 14. Remember, we looked at those in this series already. And then the book of Revelation, chapter 14, as well as 19. But then listen to this. Gog is the prince. Magog is his land. The reference to Meshech and Tubal, Moscow and Tobolsk, okay, two cities in Russia. A clear mark of identification. Russia and the northern powers have been the latest persecutors of dispersed Israel, meaning in this prophecy, and they're going to get this divine justice. And this will fall at the climax of the last mad attempt to exterminate the remnant of Israel in Jerusalem. The whole prophecy belongs to the yet future day of Jehovah, the day of the Lord, and the battle of Armageddon. Now, notice what this interpretation is going to do. Not only is it going to tell you that it's Russia and a bunch of European allies, a sort of new definition of a axis of evil that Scofield lays out here, but it sounds like there's two invasions of Gog and Magog. And in Revelation 16, and this is before the return of Christ on the white horse, you have all of the nations gathered together for the great day of God Almighty, the great battle, okay? And they gather at a place called Armageddon, as I mentioned, Megiddo. And they're utterly destroyed. It's an army of 200 million. So pretty big numbers for an ancient text. And they come from the north and the east because the river Euphrates dries up. And so you can see how they invade down. Sounds like Mongol hordes coming down. The attempt to put all these together is kind of difficult because you've got to go back and talk about what these different nations are and what they mean. So let me share this screen. This is a map from the Jewish Study Bible, the JPS as we call it. It's a very good academic Hebrew Bible. If you're going to buy one Hebrew Bible, not just for translation, but for notes and all kinds of academic reading, I would say the Jewish Study Bible for a Hebrew Bible. It's in English, but I mean the Old Testament. This I keep recommending if you want a Bible that has Hebrew Bible, New Testament, and the Apocryphal with lots of notes and maps. Very, very well done. This would be the fundamentalist Christian interpretation of it all. But this map is in the Jewish Study Bible, JPS. And notice we get a little bit of surprise here. We do have the Euphrates River. We can find the land of Israel here, the land of Canaan, right? And there's even Gaza there. But look at this. This is Genesis 10, when the three sons of Noah are divided, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So here you get the Semites, or the Shem people, still today referred to as Semitic. And then you get Ham, the African peoples, and Egypt is included with that. And then you get Japheth, And Japheth can then spread up through Europe and up through Russia, I suppose, over time. But if you're going to stay, but if you're going to, but if you're going to stay with the biblical descriptions of where these places are, you can see here Gomer, Meshech, Tubal, and Gog then being the chief prince of these areas of the world. So that would be modern Turkey today, or Asia Minor, as it's called geographically, south of the Black Sea. And here you got Ukraine up here, and we're very familiar with all of this because of all the horrible things going on in our own time north of the Black Sea with the Soviet invasion of the Ukraine. So if somebody wanted to really be literal, I suppose, with prophecies today, you would begin to think that this is some sort of a Muslim power. And if you're going to try to apply it, and I'm sure if you go to that webpage, you're going to find a lot of people doing this, that there's a Muslim power that's marching. So it does say that Persia is also included, and Egypt and some of these areas of the south. And so it could be a kind of Muslim invasion of the land of Israel today. And lots of people are trying to say that. And that would actually fit with what we read in Genesis 10. Our best guess as to where these Japhethites migrated is up into Asia Minor, and maybe later they go through the whole earth. Javan is the furthest west, and that usually refers to Greece. And Cyprus, the Kittim, remember the Dead Sea Scrolls where you have the Kittim, that later gets applied to the Romans in the time of Jesus, but it basically means these Western forces coming in. So you've got this Western, Southern, and basically Northern invasion of the land of Israel. So, I'm going to stop the share here. The Wars of Gog and Magog, read the Wikipedia article. If you can sort it out, then you're doing pretty well, and lots of people are going to tell you exactly what it is. But one of the shifts that I've seen since 9/11 and since ISIS and since Al-Qaeda and now with Hamas and what's happening in Israel is that many interpreters are moving things from a European Union or a Nazi-like power being revived and coming down and invading Israel. That was late, great planet Earth stuff. And many are beginning to say, no, this is Islamic fundamentalism. Those are the people that it makes the most sense are going to attack Israel. Well, believe me, that's going to get a lot of traction and is getting a lot of traction right now, because that seems to be what's happening in the Middle East. But remember, I'm talking about floating prophecies. And Ezekiel 38 and 39 are a kind of floating prophecy because they're introduced as the last days, but they don't seem to really apply to Israel. The land of unwalled villages where you don't even lock your doors and everything is peaceful and at rest. Also in the book of Revelation, you've got the reign of Christ for 1,000 years, where the nations apparently are learning the way of God, and all those prophecies that we read about in Daniel, Isaiah 2, Micah 4, the end of Zechariah 14, and so forth seem to be fulfilled. And then you get this invasion of Gog and Magog. So frankly, folks, to take Ezekiel 38 and 39, Revelation chapter 19 and 20, and all the other interpretations that come up in modern prophetic interpretations of Gog and Magog. If you're in World War II, it's obviously going to be Hitler. And Hitler did have plans to literally himself come down to Jerusalem, stand upon the Mount of Olives. He had sent Goebbels and other representatives to meet with Muslims there in Jerusalem. We've got pictures of them meeting. They're on the internet. I could have brought some, but I'm not covering that right now. Maybe later I will do something on how World War II should have been the end of the age because so much was in place. But there was a battle in Egypt, if you remember, with Rommel's forces that are the Nazi forces, and then Montgomery's British Allied forces. And nobody expected Rommel to be defeated. And the plan was for Rommel to defeat the British, take over the oil fields of the Middle East, and march right up into Jerusalem. And Adolf Hitler was planning to fly down to Jerusalem from Austria, from Berchtesgaden, and declare himself Lord of Lords and King of Kings. And as it was said at the time, finish the job of exterminating the Jews once and for all, because modern phases of Zionism had begun to develop, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th century. When Rommel was defeated, and of course, the United States and British forces landed at Normandy and the Allied invasion of Europe, things began to crush in on the Nazi Reich, the Third Reich, and none of that stuff was in play anymore. So once again, people had to say, well, that can't be the Gog and Magog invasion. So I guess it has to come at a later time. And here we are in 2023, and people are still replaying these scenarios. Now, you can't blame them in the sense that millions of people believe in the Bible and the inspired prophecies of the Bible, and they see them as set predictive pieces that are going to apply to the end of the age. And millions of other Christians and other kinds of believers take them more allegorically, as I covered last time, and say, no, none of this is going to happen in the Middle East today. These are symbolic ways of talking about the forces of good and evil struggling through history. Now, they don't seem to read much like that because they're so specific, burying dead bodies for 7 months and so forth, all the things in the book of Revelation. But those prophecies are always going to be out there. So what do historians do? My field of focus is not the Hebrew Bible, but I am a Bible scholar. My doctorate includes studies in the Hebrew Bible. I took reading courses in Hebrew at the University of Chicago from professors at what was then called the Oriental Institute. I studied the Dead Sea Scrolls. So even though I focused on late Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity, I'm pretty familiar with, in a general way, with biblical studies, including the Hebrew Bible. So what do the editors of a study Bible, an academic study Bible, like the HarperCollins Study Bible, what do they say about all of this? Well, what they do is they try to put these texts back in their own time, and they assume that the people who wrote them, either the authors, and I say authors of the book of Revelation, because it has a number of layers that we can untangle, and the authors of prophecies like the book of Joel, the oracles of Zechariah that we've covered, these floating prophecies, as well as the latter part of Ezekiel, because Ezekiel also has this final part to it. When you start Ezekiel, it sounds like he's talking to his own contemporary time. He's a captive in the Babylonian exile, lots of dates given. But when you get to chapter 37, 38, 39, and then 40 all the way through 48 at the end, it becomes very, very different from anything that ever remotely happened. So whether you take this as the futile hopes and dreams of these ancient writers, none of which came to pass, which I guess is a fair statement because none of it's happened yet, or if you allegorize it and claim that it's all happened, or if you're a futurist and think that it's yet to happen, maybe in your own day, you can see how the streams of interpretation part. So I think that's enough for today. The Wars of Gog and Magog, look at that Wikipedia article. You're going to be amazed. And I wish I had time to go into some of the Islamic eschatology, But in this series, I'm staying with the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, maybe in the future, or even the eschatology of the early church fathers, the Christian church fathers, or Jewish interpretations of Gog and Magog. And I will touch a bit on those because they do directly apply early Christian and ancient Jewish to ways these texts were being read at various times in history. Take care, everybody. Be safe, and I'll see you next time.